Welcome to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society. I am your host, Zachary Woodman. Joining me today is Joel Williamson of Non Serviam Media. Joel is an individualist anarchist from Texas who's been involved in various activist projects over the years. These projects range from fundraising to support political prisoners such as Ross Ulbricht, organizing counter-economic farmers markets, and engaged in various direct active action efforts. His activism has most recently been focused on Non Serviam Media, which is a small collective dedicated to exploring the world of anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas through audio and video production. If you spend much time in the left libertarian or anarchist podcast space, you've probably come across Non Serviam's excellent podcast Joel hosts called Non Serviam. If you enjoy this show at all, you probably would enjoy, if you are not already enjoying, that show. I went back and looked at our guest backlog, and roughly half of our past guests have also appeared on Joel's show. Because of the similarities between our show and audience, we figured that some crossover episodes between Non Serviam and MER were in order. I appeared on the latest episode of Non Serviam to discuss my work on democracy, nationalism, and political theory, and today we are happy to have Joel on. This was a fun conversation that covers a range of topics from the underlying philosophical foundation of Joel's anarchist outlook to agorism to praxis and direct action and the art of podcasting. It was much more exploratory and funnier than previous episodes of MER, which made for a fun and insightful change of pace. I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Also check out Joel's interview with me on Non Serviam, as well as all his other episodes if you happen to enjoy this conversation. But without further ado, here is Joel Williamson. Welcome to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I am Zachary Woodman, and joining me today from Non Serviam Media is Joel Williamson. Hi, Joel.
Hey, Zach. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, this is the second of our doubleheader podcasts. If you haven't already, I also appeared on Non Serviam earlier. And today we're going to have a bit of a discussion about sort of the more practical side of anarchism and communication of ideas, and some stuff about what exactly we're trying to do as anarchists, since that's what you've written the most about.
Yeah.
Let's start sort of generally. How did you become an anarchist? Well, how do you politically identify? Let's start there.
Well, I call myself an individualist anarchist. I mean, I think I call myself that because I think justice necessarily requires the individual to be considered within any social system. I think that this is an inescapable fact. We could go on about like how we're social animals who depend on one another, but ultimately what's the point of cooperation if the individual does not thrive within that system? I also would call myself an individualist anarchist because I think markets are not only inevitable, but necessary for discovering a wide variety of individual wants and needs. I think that subjective value is best met through through this mechanism, and is probably one of the best ways of discovering knowledge in a seemingly chaotic world, and certainly better than any central plan system is capable of doing. That said, I'm pretty well convinced that, not to be too workers here, but I'm pretty convinced that the bargaining power of your ordinary worker is like pathetically unequal to that of the boss within capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I think that the state is primarily responsible for that relationship. And, whether it's through the historical theft, such as the enclosure of the commons, or through direct and indirect subsidies to big business receives today, I think the wage system is an artificial product of the ruling class, and, one that doesn't give a fuck about us also.
So would there be a labor market under your vision of an anarchist society?
I mean, possibly. Like the free market that I support doesn't include the employee-employer relationship as we know it. Like, I support freed markets as described in the Bible that we all love, Markets Not Capitalism, where, your labor is voluntary, not limited to wasting, under the boss's thumb. I think that markets freed from capitalist domination would allow us like more dignified ways of sustaining ourselves.
But there wouldn't be like hierarchical firms, but there would still be like payment in the form of what we would call wages in the economic sense of price for labor.
Well, it's kind of like Benjamin Tucker says, like, like you have to leave open the possibility of someone working for another person. But I just think I basically agree with Carson that it's going to be pretty difficult to do that in a completely freed market. I mean, I think markets freed from capitalist domination would allow for more more dignified ways of sustaining yourself, whether it be through working for yourself or working within workers' cooperatives and stuff like that.
Just because you make the empirical bet that firms will be relatively small, and so democratic processes would enable less hierarchical divisions within firms.
I think so. But, honestly, I'd go even further and say that in an ideal freed market, like the cooperative would even be abolished in favor of working for yourself and just being able to not completely depend on this one economic system that we love so much. I mean, part of what I'm inspired by is not only the promise of markets, but, anarchism without adjectives.
Okay.
And, a lot of this is based largely upon not only how Voltaire and de Cleyre communicated those ideas or how Kevin Carson has expanded on them, but, thinkers like Eleanor Ostrom and her priceless work on, commons governance. Just as soon as I think I've got it all figured out, human cooperation sweeps in and defies my priors through arrangements that don't exactly look like markets.
Yeah.
So I say let a thousand flowers bloom as far as interacting with one another. And as long as no one's dominating anyone, I think there's just endless potential for organizing.
All right. So how did you come to have these views? What was your sort of intellectual progression into individualist anarchism?
Well, it's difficult to make a coherent summation of my path, I suppose. I certainly had some awkward detours along the way, but I'll try my best to cut out the fat for the sake of answering this question concisely. Basically, I grew up in a conservative Christian household and believed everything that everyone around me wanted me to believe. It was only when I began to doubt Christianity that I saw the seeds of radicalism start to come about. I always figured when I was younger that once I figured out what was going on with me spiritually, I could move on to developing political opinions that were my own. And basically, once I talked myself out of Christianity, like a lot of folks, I got into sort of softer religious traditions, I'll call them, like Buddhism. And I eventually stumbled across Taoism, which I don't know if you're familiar with Taoism, but some say Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao Te Ching, was a sort of a proto-anarchist. And I sort of found myself coming across accidentally anarchists and proto-anarchist thinkers along the way that, would later play a bigger role in informing my politics. Anyways, Taoism gave me sort of the tools necessary to move.
Yeah, can you expand a bit for the unfamiliar on what Taoism is and how it relates to the political vision?
Yeah, sure. So for me, Taoism, there's just some important lessons in there that, I mean, I don't consider myself a Taoist, but there's just lessons within Taoism that can sort of inform your politics in a healthy way. It's just certain lessons, very basic things like less is more. There's a lot of anti-authoritarian elements within Taoism that I find inspiring, and specifically those skepticism of authority within Taoism is what gave me the tools necessary to discovering things that at the time I felt were more radical. I mean, are more radical than what my parents wanted me to believe. But I don't know how much I could expand on Taoism now, other than just it being something that pushed me towards developing, a coherent politic. But
so you don't necessarily buy the Mysterian metaphysics going on behind Taoism, but
not necessarily. I mean, there's in fact, you could say, I mean, there's a lot of different interpretations of Taoism. You can say that there's one shortcoming of it is there's sort of this essentialist nature to it that says like whatever is in line with the Tao
Mm-hmm.
is what we should pursue. There's also interpretations of it that are more kind of not so generous, I guess. And, you know, it says that like really it's a good handbook for how to rule people and not a good handbook on how to be free. But there's a lot of different interpretations, and you can use it in a lot of different, it can overlap in a lot of different interesting ways and for different set of politics. But basically Taoism for me just, again, like allowed me, like gave me the tools necessary to doubt authority and be skeptical of it. After discovering it, it allowed me to embrace libertarianism pretty intuitively. And, I got into Ron Paul for a little bit. I don't know if you ever had a Ron Paul phase. I can't remember if you said that, whether or not on a
right. It was,
podcast, but
I had a sort of, I don't want to say love-hate relationship, but he's a politician who I don't despise, which was more than I could say. But now I would say I pretty much despise him.
Yeah, same. I mean, for better or for worse, I was into that for a little bit, and like just running in those circles, I ended up like rubbing shoulders with anarcho-capitalists, and I got into anarcho-capitalism for a brief time. But fortunately, I'm kind of embarrassed of that, but fortunately, I discovered thinkers that were more in line with individualist anarchism. Excuse me, like Lysander Spooner or Karl Hess or Samuel Edward Konkin III. And they sort of pushed me in a direction that allowed me to develop thoughts around not only rejecting the state, but also economic systems that were intimately intertwined with it, such as capitalism. And moving from there, I found organizations such as the Alliance of the Libertarian Left and C4SS that allowed me to expand my understanding of anarchism and power dynamics that deeply affect our culture in ways that weren't always so obvious to me previously. For instance, like I became convinced not only that the state and capitalism had to go, but so did, the long list of sexism, racism, queerphobia, and all those things. And so now I pretty comfortably fit within the individualist anarchism tradition, but that's basically how I got there.
Right. Sounds similar to my trajectory, although I think you had more of an ANCAP right libertarian bent.
Yeah. Not. I mean, it is what it is. It happened, and I've learned a lot since then. So
yeah, I mean, I was a neocon for a while, and I'm ashamed of that. But
yeah, who's without sin?
Right. Okay. So What do you view as the big philosophical underpinnings of your anarchism as you understand it now? If not, you don't no longer embrace like the Taoist metaphysics. Do you have more of like a materialist view, or do you go for more existentialism? What's the sort of basis of your ethical view?
Yeah, I guess the underpinnings of my politics, or like the philosophical or ethical underpinnings of my politics, might be the philosophical underpinnings of it. You might be able to fit within existentialism, although you're the philosophy major and you can tell me what box I fit in.
Okay, all right.
I mean, it's difficult to lay out an easy way of describing it. And I'll preface this with saying like I'm a layman and I don't claim to have all the answers, but this is just sort of how I see things. Like if we're getting to the roots of the underpinnings of my political philosophy, I guess you could say it's largely inspired by what you might call a radical agnosticism. And what I mean by that is agnosticism, not in the sense of like the popular sense of, well, I don't know whether or not I believe in God, like he could, or like it could, or it may not exist. What I mean is like the literal definition of it, of just being without knowledge. And particularly, I'm interested in that how, like I think there's fundamentally like unknowable things about existence that people sort of hand wave away. Like, for instance, the question of why there's something rather than nothing. Like, I think a lot of scientists will say that like the laws of physics have just always existed in sort of this mind independent way that, caused the universe to come into existence. And some theists say, obviously, that like a necessary being is required in order for the universe to exist. And honestly, like, I find both of these answers deeply unsatisfying for different reasons. And I think for better or for worse, there's just no answer to this question. But I actually think that's okay, because I think it's like precisely in not knowing that we find a radical sort of freedom that enables us a robust opportunity to construct meaning.
So is this a global, when you say radical agnosticism, is this a global skepticism about justified true belief, or is it just skepticism about justified true belief about like these deep first order metaphysical matters?
I'd say the latter more than anything. And the reason, the reason I start there is because if these like fundamental questions are not knowable, then and we don't just hand wave them away with easy answers, then again, like I think there's like that's full of radical potential. And if that's the roots of where we're going, then we can from there develop like a coherent politics. So what I mean is, and we can go into meaning and stuff like that if you want to also, but like, once you accept that we're in like a fundamental state of agnosticism, is like, as it relates to these fundamental questions, you realize that, it was only in a state of relative autonomy that you were able even to observe that. We don't have to solely focus on these like fundamentally unanswerable questions, but then, expanding autonomy for people to discover how to relate with one another and different creative ways of cooperating with one another. And so it seems to me that expanding everyone's agency to the fullest extent possible seems like a good idea. Yeah, again, not to like just postulate, what the absurd is, but just to figure out like human answers to human problems.
You don't see metaphysics as in any way providing the foundation for your ethical, political worldview?
I'm not sure, actually.
Okay.
I mean, from there, we can approach something of an ethic. Like, I for instance, like I seemingly like find myself like in an inescapable with inescapable self-interest. And then I find others around me that I depend on. And from there, it becomes obvious that their freedom, like my freedom, depends on theirs. In order to make that happen, it seems like empathy, for instance, is going to be fundamentally important in making that come to fruition. So I think it's pretty easy from there to find yourself in a position that's, nothing short of fully automated luxury anarchism.
Fully automated?
Fully automated, of course.
All right. So let's transition to that. You have this ideal of a individualist anarchist society that looks somewhat utopian to some people. So do you see your politics as aiming at a utopian vision of society?
I think that's a really interesting question. I've actually been thinking a lot about this recently, because on the podcast, one question that my buddy Clay Zobalak, who we interviewed also, he always likes me to ask my guests, how can I get a cappuccino in your imagined political utopia? And it's always interesting to me to hear how different guests respond to that, because the word utopia literally translates to no place. But there's a similar Greek word, utopos, I think it is, that translates to good place. And most radicals approach the question of utopia as referring to the good place, not sort of an unrealistic or overly idealistic no place that the word literally translates to. So I actually think that there is risk in utopian thinking, and that like it sort of imagines a future where the good place is necessarily and permanently in the future. In other words, it's never realized and doesn't inform the actions we take now. So when our good place becomes a no place, it limits us to almost a religious way of imagining our heaven that awaits us, after death. And often this means our politics owns us and not the other way around. And I see this type of thinking, for instance, like in Marxist historical materialism, and also like in, different anarchist thought also. But
yes, this is like Walter Benjamin's critique of the eschatology in Marxism.
Sure. I mean, yeah, like one of the problems with this way of like spooky thinking is it runs the risk of removing the personal from the political, and it can turn us into treating each other in nasty ways, or like even worse, like committing atrocities in the name of our no place that always awaits us, And I guess what I've been thinking about recently is just reiterating the principle of direct action and interpersonal politics through that lens. Like direct action gets the goods, but if the goods are always in the future, then we're never, it's never to be experienced. And I don't think I'm developing anything new here. Like, as like Graeber says, anarchy is something we do. I'm just afraid that, if anarchism doesn't inform your everyday life, then I'm not sure it's worth having.
Your view is that it should be viewed as attainable, and it should be viewed as being as action guiding in various ways, in ways that say store your treasures in heaven, as the Christian way of putting it has been. But it still looks to some, I think, like it's so far off, it's so distant, that it's hard to imagine how it could inform your views or your everyday political action. So how does it do that? What does it look like for, as Graeber said, anarchism to be something you do?
Well, sure. I mean, we could go into praxis, but I think basically a healthy way of looking at this is, you could call it post-utopianism, which is sort of a deliberate rhetorical move to disassociate, again, the no place from the good place. And I'm not sure if anyone else has sort of like developed this line of reasoning before, but it would be interesting to see if anyone has. But I mean, I guess getting to your question, which is basically about praxis, right?
I mean, no, it was more how does praxis relate to your vision of an ideal society? This is sort of more getting into the usefulness of ideal theory, and to put it in analytic political philosophy terms.
Yeah. So I think post-utopian action can inform our praxis, and that sort of going back to what I kind of touched on or hinted at earlier. Again, if we're not sacrificing everything for this imagined political future, like if our imagined political future is just that, in the future, then it's possible that we could miss the whole point of interacting with one another right now in a meaningful way. So it informs praxis in that, sure, like we are aiming for this free society, but like let's not forget that we're interacting with other people, and that it's probably worth treating one another with dignity and respect and empathy.
All right.
So does that answer your question?
It sort of does. So it's sort of like it's reminding me of the way like virtue ethicists talk about the ideally virtuous agent, maybe, as something that like perfectibility might not be fully attainable, but it's still action guiding.
Mm-hmm.
The sense that
exactly
it's giving you something to strive for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the no place. Like the no place isn't an ever fully realizable. Like by definition, right? Utopia, you can never arrive at it. It's no place. But if we think of it as the good place, a good place is possible to arrive at, but it's not stuck in the future. It's something that we can do now. And it's something that should inform how we act now in order to bring about that good place.
So why wouldn't one who's more moderate might look at this and say, well, since it is such an idealized future that can't really be fully implemented, and especially in present political purposes, Isn't there this worry that someone like Will Wilkinson or Jerry Gauss would raise, that if you're so myopically focused on that, you're going to forego various little improvements that could exist within present conditions in the pursuit of, as to steal the title of Gauss's book, the tyranny of the ideal?
Well, I think that's what post-utopianism is recognizing, is like the tyranny of the ideal when it becomes sort of this thing that just looms over you, like it exists necessarily and permanently always in the future and doesn't inform your everyday action. And post-utopian thought does celebrate the small ways in which we expand freedom here and now.
Right.
So
the question though is, why does that mean we shouldn't just abandon any sort of utopian thought altogether and just sort of work to improve what we have? If you are so focused on this future good place that you are unable to recognize the goods of the current system, or you are unable to work within the current system to improve it, then why should you worry about that good place in the first at all? Like, the worry that you're addressing, some might say, cuts deeper against radical politics as a whole than you might want to acknowledge.
Well, I guess for me, like a meaningful way of doing anarchism doesn't rely, it sort of gets around the problem of evangelism. And like a good alternative, for example, gives someone the ability to experience freedom now. So like an example of this might be something like the Fourth East Vinegar Collective, where if someone's sick and can't afford medicine or the tools necessary to keep living, like it's probably not necessary to to convince them to read Benjamin Tucker and embrace individualist anarchism. Like what they need is not life-saving medicine. So education is great, but expanding freedom in a radical sort of way like that completely gets around, again, the problem of evangelism or the traps of populist anarchist thinking.
Right, but the anti-radical would say, well, why don't you just work to improve the political institutions we have to provide healthcare through like liberal reformism?
Because I think largely this goes back to a cynicism that I have and that I think people should have of working within the system in general. So like, you and I talked about it in our conversation on the Non Serviam podcast, but your likelihood of affecting the outcome of an election through voting is so completely slim that it's probably not worth engaging in. And recognizing that we have a limited amount of time, money, and energy, it's probably best spent working to create alternatives that make our life better now, and those alternatives can hopefully play a big role in expanding freedom and creating that good place. You know what I mean?
All right. So what do those alternatives look like? To put it sort of more differently, what does anarchism look like in practice?
So when it comes to building a better world, again, it would like building alternative institutions and stuff like that would be something that I would promote. I started thinking this way after reading Samuel Edward Konkin's New Libertarian Manifesto, where he discouraged electoralism and instead favored counter-economics as a means to bring about a free society. And I think there are some downsides to agorism, but I still engage with it, but just with a critical lens. And we can go into that later.
What are those downsides, I guess, real quickly?
Well, let me answer your first question, which is what does a healthy anarchism look like? I can give you some examples. It's surprisingly not obvious to people, but you can write tomes on queer theory and feminist literature, but if you're treating your partner like shit, then what does it matter? So that would be a great example of of anarchist praxis interpersonally. Also, I think that again, practicing counter-economics is something you can do as a means by which we expand freedom now and help to create the new world, if anyone's unfamiliar with agorism and all that, it's just basically market illegalism. But yeah, that self-sufficiency, I think that like not having to depend on centralized institutions is definitely expanding freedom in the here and now.
Hold on, wait, real quickly. Can you expand a bit on what agorism looks like in practice with some concrete examples?
Yeah, sure. So the New Libertarian Manifesto was deeply important to me when I read it, and it still is to some extent. But agorism is a philosophy developed by Samuel Edward Konkin III, which tried to make the case that libertarians should reject electoral politics and instead embrace counter-economics. And it's basically just a tactic that tries to bleed the state dry through tax evasion and expanding the scope of what's possible outside of the state's purview. And Konkin sort of imagined the counter economy growing to the point of being able to sustain itself and eventually render the state irrelevant. I mean, some practical examples of it now. I mean, I think that you could say, so Konkin pointed out like there's different markets. There's the white market, which is the legal market, which includes like most capitalist enterprises. There's the gray market, where you're trading legal things illegally. So I could sell you a shirt, but we didn't report it to the IRS. And then there's the black market, where we're trading illegal things illegally. So like in a state where pot is illegal, I would sell you pot and obviously not report it to the IRS. There's the big example of the Silk Road that Ross Ulbricht started, who I actually met him in prison.
Yeah, we had his mother on the show a while back.
Yeah, wonderful person. And I think that was an amazing, inspiring example of giving people access to substances that the state deemed illegal in a way that was healthy, in a way that included things like such as reputation markets that allowed folks to get around the problems that are normally associated with black markets. So that's a good example.
So let's challenge, I think that's a great example, but let's challenge this agorist worldview a bit. One problem that comes to mind is it looks like a lot of the collective action problems that plague electoral politics are also involved in some of the market illegalist activities, like tax evasion. We'll just grant for the sake of argument that tax evasion would have, if everyone evaded taxes, it would have like near-term positive effects.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, first of all, unlike voting, for an example, my refusal to not pay taxes has the probability of carrying high personal costs to me. So cooperation in this sort of prisoner's dilemma is costly. And second of all, my individual refusal to pay taxes, very similar to voting, does not lead to the dismantle of the state at all. You need this to happen on a massive collective problem. So it looks like a lot of the same collective action problems that plague voting plague that type of activity. Why, if voting is so ineffective, would that be more effective?
I actually agree with you completely with that. Like I think one criticism you can make of Konkin's agorism is that you can plausibly accuse him of bike shedism, and sort of like in the way that he created a blueprint literally in steps to bring about the agora. I am inspired by agorism insofar as I think it can be one good way of helping us move from here to there. And not only, again, serving like this no place, but also just allowing us to be more free now. So I actually agree with your criticism, and I don't think that agorism in the way that Konkin spelled it out is necessarily sufficient and moving from here to there.
All right. And a second problem more centrist people would have with agorism is it looks like you're kind of whitewashing the dark side of black markets in various ways. Even the Silk Road had a lot of, dark corners going on of, hitman markets and drug trading and all that. So what exactly is supposed to serve as the check on this sort of political action to stop it from devolving into not just legalism, but immoral illegalism?
Yeah, totally. So I think you're right. It's totally possible to sort of romanticize us engaging in black markets. And I think that that's partially what Konkin was trying to address, is like when we're cooperating in these ways that are illegal in the counter economy, obviously there's all these problems that can come along with it. If someone puts a gun to your head and steals whatever substance you're trying to sell them. You can't just go to the cops. By nature of it being illegal, you're right, it encourages these sorts of brutal ways of handling things. So I think what Konkin was trying to do is point out that that's the case, and that if we want to have like a healthy counter economy, then we shouldn't engage in what he called the red market, which is just acting in sort of these brutal ways. But what he envisioned was sort of these alternative ways of handling things through arbitration and defense that didn't sort of solely rely on this brutish set of violent tactics.
So building up counter, like the reputation market stuff, counter institutions to serve as a check.
Yeah, exactly.
On individual. Okay. But of course, the state is notoriously hostile to those institutions. So in the current political life, how do you make sure those institutions are effective, given that they're always going to be challenged and maybe won't be widely used?
Sure.
Also, given that people don't really view them as viable alternatives, and so might not opt into them to allow them to grow to the sort of level of capacity that they need to have to effectively check black markets from turning into red markets.
Yeah. Well, I think that there are examples of what might fit loosely within like counter-economic defense, such as like the John Brown Gun Club. I really don't see a whole lot.
Sorry, Can you explain what that is?
Oh, they're just a gun group that promotes firearm training and access to firearms for radicals, and they go to different places and let them know like what they're, that they can provide this armed service for people. Like they've showed up at marches and stuff, but they only go to places that they're invited to. And there's, problems with that too. I'm not sort of trying to valorize them, but I'm just saying there are, Konkin gave the example of the Black Panthers as like a good example of what a defense organization would be. And obviously there's lots of problems with them too. But I think as Konkin saw it, really like the point of agorism is to brave the unknown in that way. For instance, I don't know of any like promising alternatives out there to arbitration, for instance. Like that there's a market need for that within the counter economy. And I would just absolutely, I know there's some organizations that, promote restorative justice in different ways, but wouldn't it just be wonderful if there were sort of this contract that you and I could sign that Gary Chartier arbitrated afterwards if one of us felt like the contract was violated?
These sorts of things do exist not even in the black market, but in like markets like what Pete Stringham talks about, situations where it's costly or inefficient to go to the state for every spot transaction, like in a certain sense, like Amazon, what is it called? The check on third-party sellers on Amazon. Stuff like that serves that function.
Yeah. And that's another thing is like, I have been influenced by agorism, but I think it is limiting in a certain way. I think there's all sorts of things within the white market that we could do just to create better lives for ourselves now and expand freedom in a way that isn't necessarily illegal. So yeah, you're right.
So what does praxis look like beyond agorism? You mentioned the interpersonal stuff, but what other sort of liberatory projects do you see as anarchism in praxis?
Sure. Yeah. I think I left this off when we were talking about it at self-sufficiency. There's that. I'm not all on board on cryptocurrencies, but on board with cryptocurrencies, but I think that there's some promising potential there, and also with blockchain technology. There's different experiments, actually existing experiments in like gift and barter economies that exist right now too. And it would be interesting to see people sort of develop sustainable online dark markets, that don't necessarily depend on a single head that you could chop off. There's different hacking projects, which are pretty promising, I think. No, it's not very popular, but I think there is promise in constructing intentional communities also. And that comes with its own problems, but that's one potential way of just showing that we can cooperate in different ways. It's like not the end all be all, but I see these things as stigmergic. I see these things as taking on so many different forms, so many different ways that people can interact to again, not just live for this possible future society, but expand freedom now. I mean, an example of that also might be like forming grassroots unionization under corporate hegemony. If your boss is treating you all like shit, there's different things that you can leverage, collectively to make things better. That's, I guess, another example.
How's that different from the actually existing like labor movement, like the SEIU and all that?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, you could probably expand on like the actually existing unions as we know it better than I, but as far as I understand, they've basically been defanged and, have given into like capitalist needs more than labor, and have essentially been integrated into the system so thoroughly that they're
advocacy and wage cartels now.
Yeah, you got it. And there's all those external problems that come along with it too that may or may not be good for labor. So by grassroots, I just mean, like there's small things you can do. Like your boss is treating you like shit. No, and you're bringing it up to him. No, he's not, like, they're not doing anything about it. So instead of apologizing or changing like the undignified ways that you're being subjected to, he maybe throws a party instead and is like, everyone come to the party. There's going to be free beer there. Don't go to the party. You know what I mean? Like, that's an example of collective bargaining. It's like, no, like we have serious needs that are going on here. You know what I mean? You're going to treat us better.
There are collective action problems to that without like anything like an institutional union, because he might fire you, or you might, not necessarily for not going to a party, but if you're like complaining to him.
Absolutely.
He might deny you promotions, treat you further like shit because he thinks that, there are all sorts of collective action problems embodied in labor power relations as we know it. So how can these just one spot, small interpersonal things fully address those?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. And I don't think that like unionization always works. It's just one tactic, recognizing that the bargaining power of your ordinary worker and that of a capitalist is completely unequal to that which would exist in a free market. That's one small way of possibly pulling together and increasing your bargaining power as workers. You're completely right that there's all these like externalities involved. So it is risky and it might not work in all situations, but in small ways, I think it can, and I guess, going back to my original point of agorism not being the end all be all, in the same way that syndicalists sort of promote this type of workerism as the, end all be all. I think that kind of has like similar shortcomings to it. So again, all kinds of problems with it, but looking at it as like a stigmergic, holistic, sort of pluralistic way of going about expanding freedoms in whatever way we can, then I see as a good thing. But
this all sounds quite similar to an article you wrote for C4SS 4 years ago, somewhere in that neighborhood,
mm-hmm.
In which you argued for this sort of pluralistic approach to practice to bring about a more just society. But you voiced to me that you disagree with elements of what you wrote in that article now. So what exactly is the difference between what you're saying now and what you think you were thinking 4 years ago?
Yeah, so I still largely agree with a lot of the actions that I was pointing out, but I'm always hesitant to write precisely because I'm constantly learning new things, and I'm like constantly embarrassed by like the shit that I wrote 6 months ago. So I mean, I guess to start out with, like, one of the problems that I have with the article that I wrote, it's called Autonomy in Action. I don't know, what was it, like 5 years ago, maybe six, was it 2014?
I thought it was 16.
16? Okay, yeah. Like, I guess to start out with, my usage of the word revolutionary is, I think that you can really abuse that word into it almost being meaningless. Advertisement does this all the time. New revolutionary way of fixing this problem. And I think you might...
Both Ron Paul and Bernie were calling their campaigns revolution.
Exactly. So I think that's one problem. I mean, I prefer insurrection to revolution now, although I think you could say that, the type of change that I'm promoting in that article is revolutionary in and of itself. I'm mostly just sort of hesitant and anxious about the association with the word revolutionary sort of being associated with like organizing an army to overthrow the ruling class.
So why do you prefer insurrection? Because that sounds even more like we're just going to violently overthrow things now.
Well, to me, again, I think
the framework you've provided sounds to me far more like you're advocating slow, small ways of improving the world.
Mm-hmm.
Unjust institutions more obsolete than anything like a insurrection.
I don't think that insurrection necessarily implies violence. I think that, I've brought them up too many times now in this interview, but the Fourth East Vinegar Collective, I think it's insurrectionary what he's doing, like what they're doing, like when, and it's an example of counter economics too. I think it's illegal to like develop those drugs yourself and to take them yourself. But I guess my point is that is a radical, brave act that I would say is insurrectionary, but not necessarily violent, not necessarily violence. And like one big difference again between like I see in insurrection and revolution is I think revolution sort of implies again this like formal organizing of an army to overthrow the state, whereas insurrection is more spontaneous and doesn't depend on sort of these formal, usually hierarchical ways of going about things,
Yeah, so we had another DIY Bio Lab, Counterculture Labs, Anthony DeFranco on a while back to talk about some of that, although I think Vinegar Collective is a bit more willing to work outside the bounds of the law than that org is. Okay.
The Open Insulin Project?
Yeah, the Open Insulin.
That was an excellent interview. I would definitely include that. They're relatively insurrectionary in my opinion, but yeah,
I guess
I can talk more about like the problems with my article if you want.
Why you have those associated? I mean, this is all semantics at this point, but I guess I'm vaguely confused as to why you have those associations with the word revolutionary but not insurrectionary.
Yeah. But I think that for me now, like revolutionary in the sense that I was referring to it in the article only makes sense insofar as I was promoting these huge changes. But I don't know, revolutionary sounds corny and has like to me, again, these like, I don't know, it implies sort of like these monolithic, there's just too much association. It
implies like Marxist end of history stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas like to me, like insurrection, I see it as more spontaneous. I see it as more agile and specific to certain problems,
Right. Okay. So where else do you disagree with your article?
Okay. So another thing is I described anarchism in sort of a loose way that implied sort of a cultural relativism that I don't support at any capacity. I think there's a line in there actually. Yeah. I say something like, I want to live in a world of peaceful, spontaneous experimentation where individuals can shape their own political environment, a world with an array of self-actualized communities that create their own social and economic norms without coercive third parties interfering. And I actually think that definition approaches a healthy anarchism, but is utterly insufficient in how I see anarchy now. Like, just because a certain group thinks it's okay to regularly perform sacrifice doesn't mean that it's okay just because they created it on their own volition, you know?
You've gotten less radically pluralist.
Yeah. And so I think as anarchists, we can do better. And that was another.
So how far are you willing to take this? Do you think, for an example, certain religious sub-communities or institutions would be able to thrive in this society?
Yeah, I think it's possible. Although I think since anarchism, you know, as William Gillis described it, should be thought of as an arrow rather than simply a destination, I think it's possible that where those religious institutions exist, insofar as they're promoting domination or coercion, such as like making your kids believe that if you don't believe this and you're going to spend eternity in hell, I think that as anarchists, we can criticize that and promote that that's actually a very toxic arrangement. Okay. You know what I mean?
Do you view that as part of a distinctively political project, or do you view that as sort of a conversation and culture that should be helpfully had in any society?
The personal is political. So it is political to do that. But yeah, but often that could take the form of conversation. Sure, absolutely. It doesn't mean you go and, I don't know. It doesn't mean you go and kill parents promoting that. It means you say, hey, what you're doing is coercive. Like, there's better ways of doing this. Here's examples of it. You might consider, you know, treating your kids with respect. I guess there's some other things I don't like about the article, and I'll try to make this quick. But two more things, I guess. I make a point in the article to point out that anarchists should stop infighting and start building. And I think this is a fine thing to do, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't benefit largely from just observing disagreements amongst anarchists online.
Right.
And I feel like that contributed towards like a more healthy understanding of what freedom means for me. And it can be also a useful thing, especially when we're weeding out toxic people. So, and not everyone is, I mean, I don't know. The debate is good, and we don't all have to agree in order to act. So I don't like that sort of premise there with that. Yeah, I think the last thing I can say is that while my article is promoting action and how we should live anarchism now, I think that it focuses too much on the future society and not enough on the less sexy interpersonal work that we should be participating in. And I guess that's mostly it. But maybe I'll get the courage to write again someday. But yeah, I've always been nervous about moments like this when you realize how full of shit you are. But you know, like Robert Anton Wilson says, you know, never fully believe in anyone else's BS, and more importantly, never fully believe in any of your own BS. And by that, he meant bullshit and belief systems. So.
All right. So one thing you've been doing in recent years, and even I guess back then, to promote these thoughts is working in the world of ideas. You obviously have Non Serviam Media, which has the podcast, and I'm pretty sure there's more to it than just the podcast even, for those who are unfamiliar. So I guess let's start with, what is Non Serviam now? What is its history, and where do you see it going, and how do you see it fitting into this vision we've been talking about?
Sure. So while I think action is important, I think that developing important ideas that inform our action are also equally important. I think it's possible to get into this mindset of what Konkin called library libertarianism, where we're sort of we sort of lose ourselves in our ivory towers and don't actually start practicing anarchism. So a part of what's that?
I feel personally attacked.
Well, look, we're all subject to it, and I think insofar as Non Serviam falls short of encouraging that sort of direct action, then I sort of see our mission as a failure in some ways. But I guess Non Serviam Media got started 5 years ago. Me and Stephen Leger and a handful of other folks figured we'd start recording different people to ask them a bunch of stuff about anarchism in hopes to, actually our original goal was to create a documentary. And that was sort of in line with Anarchism in America, which was a really cool documentary. I think it was released in like the late 70s. I can't remember. But we wanted to do an updated version of that. And for various different reasons, we never got around to it. But I suppose it's still in the cards for us, but we've mostly just been focusing on the podcast efforts. So I've just been interviewing a bunch of cool, interesting people to get their thoughts on different subjects. In our early days, we were focusing on video interviews. Oftentimes, we would sort of just piggyback on like different anarchist events that were happening. One of those events was organized by my buddy Cooper Williams. I don't know if you were able to go to his anarchism events in Oklahoma.
No, I unfortunately didn't. I was active. Were those the SFL ones?
I think it was like students for Civil Society.
I was organizing my own conferences in Michigan at that point. So.
Fair enough. But we went to both of those events where we started our interviews, and again, just piggybacked on the work that he did, and we sat down with different anarchists and did video form interviews. And we're just a small collective dedicated to exploring the world of anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas through audio and video production. And we basically just analyze and discuss anarchist theory from a broad range of perspectives. Right.
And your podcast is really cool. You get a lot more personal, I think, usually in your podcast than I do. So how do you like walk me through how exactly, we didn't get to do this little conversation in my interview. Walk me through how you make your podcast, how you select guests, what you think makes for a good episode.
Oh yeah. So unfortunately, I don't really, our team isn't as big as it used to be. So I'm doing the outreach to people who I want to interview. I'm doing the writing, I'm doing the recording and the editing. Fortunately now, Stephen has come on board and is helping out graphically, and just we've been brainstorming different ideas on ways to promote or to do different different types of videos and stuff. But yeah, for me, it's mostly with the podcast, it's mostly all on me. But I sort of just reach out to people who I think are interesting. They don't have to be popular. Sometimes they are, but if I think that your ideas are interesting, I'm going to ask you on and shoot the shit. Maybe I'll challenge your ideas a little bit. But yeah, that's basically how it works.
Don't know why you invited me on. I'm not.
I invited you on because, unlike me, you're able to like articulate and long form your ideas in a coherent way.
Right. So one thing that is interesting is that we've talked about this a little bit, but you seem to do a lot more prep work for your podcast than I do for this show.
Well, it's precisely because what I stated, like I've got to have a game plan moving forward. I need to get better at speaking, and if I don't write things down, then it's going to be difficult. Just because, yeah, I got to do the prep work in order for it to be a good episode.
So what's coming next for Non Serviam DC besides just more podcast episodes and stuff?
Sure. By the way, if you want to, there's like some interesting things about the name Non Serviam we can get into.
Yeah. How did you choose the name?
Like,
what does that mean? Maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, sure. And then we can go into like plans for Non Serviam. But So I've mentioned him a couple times. So Robert Anton Wilson wrote a book with Robert Shea called the Illuminati Trilogy. Mm-hmm. And this is the way I picked the name. I was reading the book at the time and came across a character describing the motley crew he ran with as not agreeing, as each of them not agreeing with one another on anything except for, quote, what the fellow with the horns told the old man in the clouds, Non Serviam. And I thought it was just a fun little line that captured the spirit of what we're going for with this project, insofar as it describes the eclectic set of anti-authoritarian perspectives we hope to capture. And as some of you may know, Non Serviam directly translates to I will not serve and is attributed to Lucifer in the Bible. And this sort of relates to anarchism insofar as, like, obviously rejecting power is like a crucial part of it, but it's clearly not sufficient in describing like a healthy politic, because it seems crucially necessary to articulate what it is that you want freedom for. So Non Serviam is like the first step, and our goal with the podcast and the video interviews is to help people explore the creative ways and interesting ways that how they vision what they want freedom for. And just another interesting fact I'll say about the name is, like, the phrase, like, another fun thing about the phrase is that it comes from the Latin translation of the Bible in reference to the fall of Lucifer. The Latin was translated from Hebrew, and some English versions of the Bible refer to it as I will not transgress, which is likely due to a scribal error, because the Hebrew word for serve and transgress looks very similar. Anyways, I thought that was an interesting coincidence because it describes like two principles that work relatively well with describing anarchism. You know, to not serve. I won't
transgress on your rights, and also I will not serve you.
It's a pretty decent starting point for, at least for thinking and hopefully acting in radically free ways. Right. But yeah, that's the fun, interesting background to the name.
So what's next for Serviam?
Well, hopefully in May Day we will be. I mean, one thing that we've been doing recently is we started Non Serviam clips, which basically we've just been going through past interviews and capturing small little portions of different things that people have said, and putting them into like 1 to 5 minute videos, just articulating different things. One big thing we hope to do is come May Day, we hope to have a launch. We hope to launch different. We want to create a platform where different podcasts can exist through Non Serviam, and maybe even different shows can exist through Non Serviam. Like the podcast would be long form, like theory based, and then the shows would be more like topical and focusing on like recent events through an anarchist perspective. We kind of have like big hopes with that. I don't know how much of it is achievable in that short of a time frame, but I do think that the listeners can at least expect there to be at least one more podcast that we host. So that's where we're moving in the immediate future.
Cool. What are some of your favorite episodes? Maybe you don't have favorites, but what are some of your favorite episodes of Non Serviam so far?
Ooh, that's hard to say. Just from like an editorial stance, I find that the further back I go, the least I like them less, because I wasn't as good as editing back then. I'm now like incorporating like different music and stuff now, just so from an aesthetic point of view, the newer the better. But as far as guests go, I don't know if I have a particularly favorite guest, although I will say as far as lightning rounds go, I think Jahed Mamand blew it out of fucking water on the lightning rounds. We do this little gimmick where I list like a series of ideas. I did it with you, Right. I list like a series of ideas or people, and I give my guests like 1 minute or less to respond to each item. And I got to say, I think jawheads is admirable. And it made me so excited to hear how quickly he could articulate in such a short amount of time the responses to each of the items that I listed. So don't know if I have a favorite episode, but that was probably my favorite moment. One of my favorite moments on the podcast.
Cool. So we always like to end this podcast with this question that no one seems to like. I mean, people like the audience likes it. The guests don't like it. What are 3 books, articles, novels, plays, movies, documentaries, dance performances, what have you, video games even, that were influential over how you think and what you and the audience should look at to learn more?
I didn't think that you're going to hit me with dance routines. I mean, shit.
I'm just trying to expose how open-ended the question is.
I think the moonwalk is pretty inspiring. To the stars. I guess as far as, so I don't know how satisfying this is going to be for you to hear, but recently I saw that the Anarchist library was down. So I think that's just but there is another website that's up right now that people can access. I think it's usa.anarchistlibraries.net, where you can still access just a huge amount of literature that is based around anarchist thought that you can search and just look up all sorts of things there. So the Anarchist Library would be one for me. I've already mentioned it, but I love the documentary Anarchism in America. I think that if you are looking for something that's not that long, I think it's like an hour long or something like that, something fun to learn about anarchism. Anarchism in America is great, and hopefully in the future Non Serviam will do an updated version. We'll see. And then I guess my third thing is Sorry Not Sorry, but the Bible, market's not capitalism. You got to read that.
The Bible. You need to stop not referring to it that way. Yeah, I think that is the 6th or 7th time someone's recommended that book on this show.
I'm sorry. I mean,
I'm gonna have to at some point just say you can't recommend Markets Not Capital. But I think I also recommended it on your show. So anyway, so plug some stuff. Where can people find your work? Obviously the podcast, but what else is there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I sometimes change my handle. If people want to follow me, they can go at NalevoA3 to follow me on Twitter. As far as Non Serviam Media goes, we have a website, nonserviam.media, where you can view all of our video interviews as well as our podcast episodes. And we're also on YouTube, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes. We just created an Instagram. And basically anywhere podcasts are found, you can more than likely find us there.
All right. Joel Williamson, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Zachary.